What if I told you that the emotional distance you are feeling right now is not random, and it is not only happening to them? It is happening because of the space that exists between both of you. And here is the part that most people never notice. Your soulmate is not only going through something inside themselves, they may actually be emotionally reacting to the relationship itself in ways that neither of you fully understands yet. You first notice it in the silence, the shorter replies, the delayed responses, and the emotional flatness where warmth once existed. Then your mind begins filling in the empty spaces. Did I do something wrong? Are they losing interest? Is this the beginning of the end? But emotionally intense relationships rarely fall apart in obvious moments. They usually change through small emotional shifts, where one person becomes overwhelmed while the other becomes confused. And confusion is where anxiety begins creating stories that may not reflect the truth. Emotional storms inside relationships often begin with quiet withdrawal instead of clear conflict. That is exactly what makes them so easy to misunderstand. One partner may begin replying less, becoming quieter, or appearing emotionally unavailable. From the outside, it can seem like they no longer care, or that their feelings are fading away. In reality, this pattern is often the nervous system trying to regulate emotional overload. When someone is emotionally flooded by stress, unresolved inner conflict, or even tension within the relationship, they may no longer have the emotional energy to process interaction in real time. Instead of staying engaged, they reduce the amount of emotional input they receive. This is not always a conscious decision. It is often an automatic protective response where the mind tries to create distance so it can regain a sense of inner stability. Silence, delayed replies, or emotional flatness can therefore become forms of self-soothing rather than signs of rejection. The challenge is that relationships work as two-way systems. One person's withdrawal never stays emotionally neutral. The other partner often experiences that same distance as uncertainty or possible loss, which activates anxiety and increases attention toward every small change. The mind starts searching for meaning in tiny details, changes in tone, different timing, reduced warmth, and begins creating explanations. Because human beings naturally dislike uncertainty, the brain would rather create a complete story than remain with unanswered questions, even if that story is not completely accurate. That is where misunderstanding begins to grow. What is actually emotional overload in one person can easily be seen as emotional disengagement by the other. On a deeper level, this pattern becomes even stronger in emotionally meaningful relationships because closeness naturally increases sensitivity. The more someone cares, the more noticeable even the smallest emotional changes become. This creates a repeating cycle where withdrawal leads to anxiety, anxiety leads to questioning or chasing reassurance, and that pursuit creates even more withdrawal. Neither person is intentionally trying to damage the relationship. Both are simply reacting to their own internal emotional state rather than responding to the shared reality between them. Over time, this creates a pattern that feels emotionally unstable, when in truth, it is often just two different coping mechanisms colliding under pressure. These reactions are shaped more by each person's ability to regulate emotions than by the actual amount of love or care they feel for one another. When emotional distress becomes very strong, many people do not communicate it directly. This is not because they want to confuse someone or hide the truth. Often, they simply do not have complete clarity about what they are feeling themselves. Emotional overwhelm can reduce access to language, reflection, and even the ability to name emotions correctly. During those moments, the mind shifts into survival-oriented responses, and communication often becomes indirect. Instead of saying, "I'm hurt," "I'm overwhelmed," or "I need some space," a person may express those feelings through behavior such as withdrawal, irritability, inconsistency, or silence. These actions are not always intentional signals designed to confuse another person. They are often the only emotional outlets available when someone's ability to process emotions becomes limited. This happens especially in relationships where emotional intensity is high, because deep closeness can activate unresolved emotional patterns. When emotions become too large to organize internally, the nervous system focuses on restoring stability before it focuses on explaining feelings. So instead of describing the emotional storm, the person quietly steps away from interaction. To them, that distance may feel like the safest way to avoid making the situation even worse or becoming even more emotionally overwhelmed. However, because no explanation comes with the behavior, the other person is left trying to understand an absence without any real context. That gap in understanding becomes the place where emotional misalignment begins. The partner who is not emotionally overwhelmed naturally starts searching for reasons behind the change. They may assume emotional distance, loss of interest, or growing detachment, when in reality, the behavior is often rooted in struggles with internal emotional regulation, rather than an actual evaluation of the relationship itself. Emotional acting out begins replacing emotional expression, and this shift can make relationship patterns appear confusing or inconsistent. Another important layer is that indirect communication often carries unconscious emotional signals. Even when very few words are spoken, changes in tone, timing, and emotional presence quietly communicate that something inside is not right. The receiving partner senses that something has changed, but cannot clearly identify what it is. That uncertainty naturally increases emotional tension. Human beings are wired to reduce uncertainty whenever possible. As a result, the mind starts creating explanations, often making those explanations personal. This is how emotional storms slowly become relationship storms, rather than remaining private emotional experiences. What begins as internal overwhelm inside one person slowly becomes an interpreted change in the relationship for the other person. Not because anyone intended to involve their partner, but because emotional distress rarely remains completely contained when two people share a deep and ongoing emotional connection. Without clear communication, one person's internal struggle gradually turns into shared confusion that neither partner fully understands in the beginning. The belief in a soulmate connection often increases emotional investment. Along with that greater investment comes a much stronger sensitivity to even the smallest changes inside the relationship. When someone feels deeply connected to another person, the nervous system starts treating that relationship as emotionally important for safety, stability, and even personal identity. Because of this, any change in tone, emotional warmth, or availability is not processed as neutral information. Instead, it is experienced as something meaningful that could signal disruption or possible loss. The emotional stakes begin feeling much higher, causing perception to become more reactive. This amplification happens because attachment systems are naturally designed to protect closeness and maintain connection. When the relationship feels secure, the nervous system remains calm and regulated. But when uncertainty appears through inconsistent communication or emotional withdrawal, the system shifts into constant monitoring. In that state, attention becomes narrowly focused on the relationship itself, and the mind grows extremely sensitive to every possible sign of change. A delayed message, a shorter reply, or even a slightly different emotional tone can suddenly feel much more significant than it really is. Not because those changes are objectively large, but because the internal attachment system has already become activated. At the same time, believing someone is your soulmate can create a powerful story of uniqueness and emotional irreplaceability. While this belief can strengthen intimacy, it can also increase vulnerability to anxiety. When the relationship begins feeling uncertain, the mind may unconsciously see emotional changes as evidence that something permanent is breaking, creating even greater emotional reactivity. This is not a logical process. It is an attachment-driven system trying to preserve stability in a relationship that feels deeply important. At the same time, stronger attachment reduces a person's ability to tolerate uncertainty. A casual relationship may allow room for unanswered questions, but a deeply meaningful connection often does not. The need for clarity becomes stronger, and when that clarity is missing, the mind quickly fills the empty spaces with assumptions. Those assumptions often lean toward fear because the emotional cost of possible loss feels so significant. As emotional sensitivity continues increasing, emotional reactions also become stronger. Small changes begin feeling much larger than they really are. Neutral behaviors begin carrying emotional weight they may never have intended to carry. Uncertainty begins feeling urgent and impossible to ignore. Yet none of this necessarily reflects the true condition of the relationship. More often, it reflects the intensity of an attachment system responding to what it believes could be emotional instability, something the mind has marked as deeply important for emotional balance. Unresolved emotional wounds often become active in relationships that feel truly meaningful. This does not happen because the other person is causing harm. It happens because emotional closeness creates a sense of psychological safety that allows hidden feelings to rise to the surface. Trauma is not only about difficult events from the past. It is also about the emotional mark those experiences leave on the nervous system. When someone enters a close relationship, especially one that feels deeply meaningful or intimate, the nervous system slowly begins to lower some of its defenses. That slight feeling of safety can unexpectedly unlock older emotional memories, physical sensations, and fears that were pushed aside simply to keep functioning in everyday life. This is one reason emotional reactions in current relationships can sometimes seem much stronger than the situation itself. A simple comment, a delayed reply, or even a small change in someone's tone of voice may trigger a reaction that feels much bigger than the present moment deserves. What is actually becoming active is not only the current interaction, but also an older emotional pattern stored within the nervous system. The conscious mind may not recognize that the reaction is connected to the past. Instead, it experiences everything as though it is entirely about the relationship happening right now. In close emotional bonds, this kind of activation happens more often because intimacy naturally reduces psychological distance. The closer two people become, the more opportunities there are for hidden emotional material to rise into awareness. This does not automatically mean the relationship is unhealthy. Instead, it often shows that the relationship has become emotionally meaningful enough to reach deeper levels of personal experience. Without awareness, however, this process can create confusion because emotional reactions feel immediate and connected to the present relationship, even when part of them comes from earlier life experiences. Another important point is that unresolved trauma often carries lasting emotional expectations, such as fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, or fear of inconsistency. Whenever a small signal in the relationship resembles those old emotional experiences, the nervous system responds as though the original danger has returned. This may lead to increased alertness, emotional withdrawal, or sudden changes in behavior that seem out of proportion to what is actually happening. The challenge comes from the overlap between past emotional memories and present experiences. The partner who is emotionally activated may feel completely overwhelmed without fully understanding the reason, while the other partner experiences the result as emotional distance or an unexpected shift in the relationship. This creates a complex emotional situation where the present relationship becomes a place where unresolved experiences from the past are quietly replayed through emotional reactions that feel real, immediate, and difficult to separate from what is happening now. If even a small part of this feels familiar to you, stop for a moment and ask yourself one simple question. Am I reacting to what is truly happening, or am I reacting to what I fear it might mean? That single question can completely change the way you choose to respond next. Emotional dysregulation in one partner can slowly reshape the entire relationship, because relationships are much more than simple exchanges of words or actions. They are ongoing interactions between two nervous systems that constantly affect one another. When one person struggles to regulate emotions, moving quickly between overwhelm, withdrawal, anxiety, frustration, or irritability without being able to regain inner balance, that instability rarely stays contained within them. Instead, it gradually influences the rhythm, emotional tone, and overall feeling of safety within the relationship itself. In these situations, the emotionally dysregulated partner may not always explain what they are feeling. Rather than expressing everything directly, their inner emotional struggle often appears through inconsistent availability, changing moods, or sudden shifts in how engaged they seem. Sometimes they may feel warm, connected, and emotionally present, while at other times they may seem distant, quiet, or emotionally unavailable. This inconsistency creates an emotional environment that feels difficult to predict for the other person, who naturally begins adjusting their own behavior in response. Without fully realizing it, the relationship slowly starts revolving around managing emotional instability instead of simply enjoying mutual closeness. The partner on the receiving end often becomes more watchful, paying close attention to changes in mood, communication, or behavior in an effort to anticipate what might happen next. This increased awareness is not usually an attempt to control the other person. Instead, it becomes an understandable response to repeated unpredictability over time. Eventually, this pattern can create emotional exhaustion because the relationship no longer feels consistently safe or dependable. Rather than relaxing into the connection, the mind stays alert, constantly trying to interpret signals and prevent another emotional disconnection. At the same time, the emotionally dysregulated partner may also feel misunderstood or pressured because their internal experience feels overwhelming, yet remains difficult to describe clearly. When emotions become too intense, they may withdraw temporarily to regain a sense of control. Unfortunately, that withdrawal is often experienced by the other partner as rejection or emotional abandonment. This creates a repeating cycle in which one person's attempt to calm themselves internally unintentionally creates instability within the relationship itself. What makes this emotional pattern especially complicated is that neither person is necessarily trying to hurt the other or create distance. Both individuals are responding to emotional states that have not been fully regulated. However, because each person's ability to regulate emotions is different, the relationship slowly adapts around the less stable emotional patterns. As time passes, the roles within the relationship may quietly change. One partner gradually becomes the emotional stabilizer, while the other becomes the emotional variable. This silent shift begins shaping how safety, closeness, communication, and emotional security are experienced inside the relationship, even though neither person consciously intended for these roles to develop. Many disagreements in close relationships appear to be about the present situation, but a surprisingly large number of them are actually influenced by emotional experiences from the past that are being reactivated in the current moment. This happens because the brain does not store emotional memories only as stories or clear narratives. Instead, it stores them as patterns of bodily sensations, expectations, emotional meanings, and protective responses. Whenever something in the present resembles an earlier emotional wound, even in a very subtle way, the nervous system can respond as though the original painful experience is happening again, despite the fact that today's situation is completely different. This explains why arguments often become much bigger than the issue that started them. A simple disagreement about timing, attention, communication, or tone of voice can quickly become filled with much deeper emotional meaning. The present moment becomes mixed with earlier memories of feeling ignored, misunderstood, rejected, abandoned, or emotionally unsafe. At that point, the emotional reaction is no longer only about what was said or done. It also becomes about what those actions symbolize on a much deeper emotional level. The person is responding not only to their partner, but also to the emotional imprint left behind by previous relationships and life experiences that were never fully understood, healed, or resolved. Because these reactions happen automatically, people often sincerely believe they are responding appropriately to what is happening in the present. The emotional intensity feels completely justified because it is being fueled by both current events and older emotional activation happening beneath conscious awareness. Meanwhile, the partner receiving that reaction often experiences it as confusing or far greater than the current situation seems to require, because they are only aware of what is happening now, not of the deeper emotional history being activated inside the other person. This difference creates a breakdown in communication. One partner is responding to an emotional reality made up of both the present and the past, while the other partner is responding only to the present moment. As a result, both people end up feeling misunderstood. The person experiencing emotional activation feels that their inner pain is unseen or ignored, while the other partner feels unfairly blamed for something they never intended to cause. Over time, this repeating pattern can create familiar cycles where the same emotional themes appear again and again during conflicts. Even when the details of each disagreement are different, the deeper emotional trigger often stays exactly the same. As a result, the arguments repeatedly return to the same emotional ground. Without recognizing this layering effect, couples may continue trying to solve the surface problem over and over again, while never addressing the deeper emotional pattern that continues driving the conflict beneath everything else.